This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the Institute of Latin American Studies, and I would particularly like to welcome Matthew Restall, who has not only made the journey across the Atlantic to be with us, but sacrificed part of his sabbatical leave, which he's currently taking at the John Carter Brown Library. Matthew is, as a lot of American titles are, Edwin Earl Sparks, Professor of Colonial Latin American History, Anthropology and Women's Studies, located in the Department of History at Penn State University. He's author of some 20 books which focus on three main themes, which are Mesoamerica, primarily Yucatan and the Maya. That's one thing. The second is on Africans in Spanish America, and the third on the Spanish Conquest. His book on the Black Middle, Africans, Mayas and Spaniards in Colonial Yucatan, won the Conference on Latin American History Prize for the best book in Mexican history in 2009. As the title of his chair suggests, and also the fact he's co-editor of Ethnohistory, it's clear that Matthew is not a narrow, if you like, colonial historian, but wide-ranging, and actually engages with debates in other areas, particularly in anthropology and gender studies. Matthew, I think, is well known for his revisionist sort of approach to colonial history, exemplified in his 7 Myths of Spanish Conquest, which many of you, I'm sure, are aware, where he explores the ways in which the history of the Spanish Conquest has been misread and passed down to become popular knowledge. His sort of revisionist approach to his scholarship, I think, is exemplified by the abstract of this paper in your programme, where what one has there is a series of questions rather than a factual statement of what the talk will contain. In challenging accepted wisdom, Matthew is generally regarded as one of the main architects of, if not the architect, of the field which has come to be known as the New Conquest history, which provides new interpretations of the conquest and often involves the use of native indigenous sources. His talk this evening, turning Cortés and Moctezuma upside down, thus exemplifies, I think, the area in which he works, but also his approach. And I think he's going to be giving us a glimpse of what is going to be his new book on Cortés and Moctezuma. I've not seen this, but I gather we're not only in for a treat in terms of the scholarship, but also in terms of the images that Matthew will be showing. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew now, and there will be time for questions at the end of the lecture. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Linda, for that generous introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to London. I was actually born here, but my family left when I was 3 years old, and I've never really lived here since then, so it's nice to come back. And the last couple of days that I've been here, everybody in London is so nice. What is that? Have they always been that nice? I don't remember that. Are people just happy that it's not raining or something? And Linda and Olga both seem so capable. I'm thinking maybe they could arrange for a nice job for me here, maybe a flat in Cartwright Gardens or somewhere nearby. And so do encourage them in that regard afterwards. Thank you also to those of you who've chosen to come into the talk and not skip the talk and go straight to the reception, which would be the natural thing to do. Particularly as I've looked through the conference program, and it doesn't look as if any of you work in this particular topic, in which case you're outside your kind of normal comfort zone. It means I can also get away with some outrageous statements, I hope. What I'm going to be talking about this evening is a meeting. I call it The Meeting with a capital M. The book I'm working on is, if I can find somebody to publish it, going to be called The Meeting. It's one of the great meetings of human history, possibly, arguably, the greatest meeting, the moment when two empires, two great civilizations, the two halves of humanity were brought irreversibly together. So forget the Bering Strait, forget Eric the Red, forget Columbus sailing the ocean blue. The real discovery in America was November the 8th, 1519, the day when the Spanish conquistador Fernando Cortés first met the Mexica Emperor Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, or as I call him, Montezuma, or as he appears in all of my notes, Monty, at the entrance to the imperial capital city of Tenochtitlan. Imagine what it must have been like to see Mexico Tenochtitlan for the first time. News of the city certainly caused quite a stir back in Europe. Cortés claimed it was as big as Seville and Cordoba, with a main tower higher than the tower of the cathedral in Seville, and two vast plazas, one twice as big as the city of Salamanca's. His description, written before his siege of the city destroyed it, was printed multiple times in Europe starting in 1522. The title page to the first edition proclaimed that this newly discovered world contained very large cities and marvelous buildings, and great commerce and wealth. And among these, there is one more marvelous and rich than all of them, named Temixtitan. Words were hardly enough to do the place justice, and indeed a map was also sent to the King of Spain, probably drawn by a Mexica artist, but surviving only in the form of a hybridized rendering engraved for a Latin edition of Cortés' second letter, first printed in Nuremberg in 1524. The Spanish company, not a band or handful of adventurers, as you will still read in even the newest books, but the Spanish company, Compañía, that would become history's most famous and most mythologized conquistador group, spent over 6 months traveling into the heart of the Mexica or Aztec Empire. On the morning of November the 8th, they reached a gate to the city's entrance, where Montezuma and his entourage met them. Here is an arrow pointing to where in that imaginary city they met, most likely. And here's a rather shabby-looking plaque commemorating that, and the shabbiness of it tells you something about the complex modern Mexican relationship with this event. In Cortés' own account of the meeting, extant both in an early manuscript version and the printed edition that we just saw the frontispiece of a moment ago, 1,000 men first came out to greet him. That took nearly an hour, Cortés says, followed by Montezuma and his brother. And when the emperor descended from his litter, I dismounted, recounted the conquistador, and went to embrace him alone, but the two lords who were with him stopped me with their hands so that I did not touch him. 200 lords then each greeted Cortés, after which everyone walked a little further into the city before Cortés and Montezuma stopped to exchange necklaces. The Spaniards were then led into, quote, a very large and very beautiful house. It was actually the palace of Montezuma's father and predecessor on the throne. There Montezuma asked Cortés to, quote, sit on a very rich throne, where he was presented with many varied treasures of gold and silver and featherwork. Montezuma then delivered an astonishing speech, which even more astonishingly, Cortés reported verbatim a year later, as if he remembered all 530 words of its Spanish translation. The emperor supposedly revealed that generations ago the Aztecs had been guided to Mexico by an ancient lord who then departed, but whose return they had awaited ever since. That moment, Montezuma told Cortés, had now come, for the emperor believed the Spaniards to be descended from that ancient lord, and therefore, quoting from Cortés' account of the meeting, therefore we believe and hold as certain that this great lord or king who sent you here is our natural lord, nuestro señor natural, and therefore you may be sure that we will obey you and hold you as Lord in place of that great Lord of whom you speak. So, when a year later, Cortés offered the Spanish king this unambiguous vision of the meeting as a surrender, that king, Charles, became doubly an emperor, having been elected Holy Roman Emperor in June of 1519. The surrender became the cornerstone of subsequent Spanish actions, justifications, and narrations, ultimately serving to legitimize 3 centuries of colonial rule. And in the wake of Cortés' account, many others were written down, drawn, or painted in the 16th century and beyond, with no shortage of interpretations up to the present. Aside from slight variations in the many textual versions, the essential theme of Montezuma's surrender persisted. Cortés' narrative became conquest gospel. It also survived in visual form, whether embellished in the early modern European imagination. There are examples from late colonial period, or what for Europeanists is the late early modern period. You can see at some point bare-breasted Aztec women apparently become essential to the depiction. Or the simpler rendering of late 16th century Nahua artist. And yes, if you want to talk about the chap standing in the middle holding the horse, I've written about him in the past, that's really interesting, but not the main focus now. Or with the emphasis on the encounter as a capture, a theme found in Spanish images, such as the title page to Bernal Diaz's True History or Historia Verdadera. And here is the detail on the left, and then as we're moving in yet into further detail on the right, you can see here's Cortés leaning forward to take Montezuma's very European-looking crown with his left hand and then put him in manacles or shackles with his right hand. If anyone knows of anywhere where that particular image is discussed in print, please tell me. I've been looking for a year and I, to my amazement, can't find that anybody has commented on it. I'm sure somebody has somewhere. And also, finally, last example, Nahua Franciscan accounts such as Sahagun's Florentine Codex. And again, here the emphasis on the capture. Now, in the late 20th century, more of interest to you lot, right? Scholars reached for a Nahua-centric view of the meeting. Some concluded that Montezuma's speech was apocryphal, Anthony Pagden, for example, or totally fictitious, Eulalia Guzman in the 1950s, John Eliot, a stew of half-baked biblical and siete partidas ingredients cooked up by Cortés. But the increased availability of the Florentine Codex, from which this is taken, because it contained a version of Montezuma's speech in Nahuatl, repeating the traditional surrender theme, but couched in indigenous terms that were widely read as reflecting the true vision of the vanquished. The increased availability of that was important. In this version, Montezuma declares that for generations, the emperors of Mexico have awaited the prophesied return of their ancient sovereign. And now, he tells Cortés, it has come true, you have come. Be doubly welcome, enter the land, go to your palace, rest your body, may our lords be arrived in the land. So, the Nahua-centric view, while attempting to see the encounter through the lens of Mexica culture and to give Montezuma agency, served only to reinforce the emperor's status as blameworthy and blind. Cortés is not identified with any specific Aztec god in early sources, but modern scholars have seized on the myth of the deified ruler Quetzalcoatl as the solution to the riddle of Montezuma's surrender. All through the 20th century, in Spanish, French, and English, Montezuma bowed to the will of the god ruler Cortés Quetzalcoatl. Thus, the catalogue to the 2002 Royal Academy exhibition, Aztecs, wonderful exhibition, it merely expressed the prevailing interpretation with lines such as, quote, the fact that Hernán Cortés arrived from the east, the direction in which Quetzalcoatl had vanished, and met Moctezuma II on Quetzalcoatl's name day, has often been seen as a crucial factor in the downfall of the Aztec Empire. And, one other quote, This is said to be the reason why the Aztec ruler Montezuma welcomed Hernán Cortés in 1519 with open arms, mistaking him for the hero king returning from the sea. In other words, the traditional narrative of surrender survived, just dressed in indigenous clothing. Why is the meeting important? 3 reasons. 1, the reason with which I began, it's one of history's great milestone encounters. 2, because of the larger relationship between history and meetings. In a nutshell, history is encounter. The past is comprised of all the encounters that have brought people together. Encounters both simple and complex, peaceful and conflictual. So let us go one step further. History is the dynamic whereby 2 worlds generate an encounter, which thereby alters those worlds, a self-generating dynamic built around multiple encounters. This is similar to what the structuralist anthropologist Marshall Sahlins has called the structure of the conjuncture. So one final step further, if you will, and this is a sort of home-brewed historical theory here, but it really is about 90 seconds, I promise I've timed it. History is the sum of all the surviving narratives of those encounters. But that sum of narratives is far from tidy. It is messy, replete with omissions, fabrications, and contradictions. And the dynamic of encounters is often highly complex. So as a result, one narrative tends to be privileged over the others, a traditional narrative, if you like, an appealing tale to mask the unappetizing mess that is reality. The great English diplomat and historian E.H. Carr asserted a half-century ago that history cannot exist without interpreters. So for Carr, history was a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, so that without their historian, the facts are dead and meaningless. So what I'm suggesting here is that history, being all the encounters of the past, only exists for us through that continuous process of interaction between alleged and apparent facts and all their historians. And by historians, I don't just mean us lucky inhabitants of the ivory tower, but all the witnesses and writers whose narrations and interpretations have allowed past encounters to survive. What that means, therefore, is that the traditional narrative of the Cortés-Moctezuma meeting is highly likely to be unfaithful, distorted, or even a dramatically fictitious rendering of the event. The real encounter that day must have been seen, understood, interpreted, remembered, and recorded in diverse ways, creating a picture far messier than the one painted by Cortés. Furthermore, and this brings me to the 3rd reason why I would like to convince you that the meeting with a capital M is so important. The traditional narrative of the entire conquest of Mexico, as well as the traditional portraits of Cortés and Moctezuma, effectively stem from that account of the meeting. So if we rethink the meeting, we can rethink its protagonists and vice versa, and thereby rethink the entire history of conquest and early colonization in the Americas. Okay, let's start with Cortés. The surrender has typically been seen as a reflection of Cortés's military and diplomatic genius. And the story goes like this. Cortés's long early years, he doesn't meet Montezuma until he's 34, are imagined as inevitably leading to glory in Mexico, as pregnant with an incipient brilliance and impatient ambition. The coverage of these early years was often influenced by Francisco López de Gómara's 1552 biography, titled Conquista de México. William Robertson, for example, in his 1777 History of America, has the young Cortés quitting the study of law in Spain because, quote, he was soon disgusted with an academic life which did not suit his ardent and restless genius. I wonder if my mother would say that if I retired early. Going on to fulfill his destiny, Cortés is able to conquer the Aztec Empire with just a few hundred men through a combination of violence and negotiation. And Montezuma's surrender legitimizes his conquest and justifies the subsequent war and imposition of colonial rule. Cortés then builds on Montezuma's surrender by taking him captive. This is a week after the meeting. exacting a notarized transfer of sovereignty. This happens 2 months after the meeting. Then when the Aztecs kill Moctezuma and revolt, now 6 months after the meeting, Cortés brilliantly builds a righteous alliance to recover control of the city and the empire. This is the legendary Cortés of the 1528 Viditz medallion. I have 1529 in my slide, I think that's wrong. Also the full-length portrait of Cortés that's now in the Hospital de Jesus in Mexico City, which was founded by Cortés on the site of the meeting. And the portrait is in the style of royal portraiture. This is actually a later copy of a lost early portrait. And if you look at this, for example, you can see how I'm not an art historian, and I haven't tracked down this to be able to make the case, but I suspect that someone simply copied the famous earlier painting and put Cortés's head on instead of the King of Spain. After the Aztec War, and especially after Cortés's death in 1547, the hagiographies began, and they have yet to cease. Here's the front cover of Gómara's book again. From López de Gómara all the way up to the one that I've been reading most recently by a French scholar, Christian Duverger. Cortés became Caesar, hero, founding father of a nation. The Franciscans virtually deified him as the providential means whereby Christianity was brought to Mexico, with credit and praise heaped upon him by Valadez, Mendieta, Motolinilla, Sahagún, Torquemada, and so on. This valiant captain, wrote Jerónimo de Mendieta in his Historia Ecclesiastica Indiana, was chosen as a new Moses to free the Indian people. But this theme became elemental to the Cortés legend. The Spanish poet Gabriel Lasso de la Vega asserted that Cortés and Luther, being born on the same year, was no coincidence, even though it actually wasn't true. It was clear to veteran conquistador Bernardo de Vargas Machuca that, quote, God prepared, ordered, and guided the entry into New Spain of that great gentleman and Christian. And the theme of Cortés as the providential agent for the spread of the gospel runs thick in López de Gómara's hagiography. Although Gómara's decision to criticize the conquest of Peru resulted in his Historia being banned, the book still went on to be an international bestseller, read illicitly but widely in Spanish, and selling out at least 22 editions in Italian, French, and English by the end of the 16th century. As Richard Kagan recently observed, it was in effect the official history of the Spanish New World, influencing subsequent best-selling accounts of the conquest of Mexico from Antonio de Solis to the two Williams, Robertson in the 18th century, Prescott in the 19th, to numerous 20th century versions. Gómara's impact has been unstoppable. Of course, there was, and still is, a far less flattering view of Cortés. The arrow points to the person that I believe, and in this Diego Rivera mural, is supposed to be Cortés. Rooted partly in hostility from his many enemies in his own lifetime, and partly in the black legend, it is mostly a modern Mexican phenomenon tied to independence, the revolution, and indigenismo, with Cortés a grim symbol of colonialism. I'm throwing a lot of stuff in here, and as a colonialist, forgive me for doing so much harm to the modern period. This statue, I'm not sure if this is still in the corner that it was moved to, but it was put up in 1982 in Mexico City in Coyoacán and was instantly controversial, was vandalized, there were demonstrations. I'm still tracking down any kind of newspaper articles or study that explained what happened, but I couldn't help but notice, and these are not pictures that I took, these are pictures that I found online, but in some of them, the child of Cortés and Malinche, who's a character I'm just throwing out there and can talk about, I'm not going to explain who she is right now, I expect most of you know, but their child, Martin, one of the two Martin Cortéses, has been stolen at some point, and he's there on the bottom right, you can see him there, and he's been taken, poor chap. The negative portrait the alternative view of Cortés, a negative portrait of him, has never undermined or upended the legend, because it easily serves as the reverse side to the same coin. So the bold, brilliant strategist is also the cold pragmatist who commits atrocities in the war, either because he's a tyrant, that's in the phrase of Bartolomé de las Casas, or because it was a strategy for saving Spanish lives and achieving peace through victory, kind of a twisted modern argument that's used by Mendieta in the end of the 16th century. The larger-than-life hero is also the womanizer, who strangles his first Spanish wife when she objects to his first household in Mexico being full of his concubines. Cortés as a macho man is an image that can contain most elements of his traditional portrait, one as recognizably positive to 16th century Spaniards as it might be recognizably offensive to 21st century Mexicans. So if the surrender underpins this laudatory, hagiographic view of Cortés, it also underpins the derogatory view of Moctezuma. The view of Moctezuma the view of the meeting as a voluntary act of surrender created a winner and a loser, each dependent on the other for their image to be whole. Cortés has been the anti-Moctezuma and Moctezuma the anti-Cortés. Comparative lit scholar Gordon Sayre recently called them monstrous doubles of one another. In the traditional narrative, Moctezuma is so unnerved by the Spanish arrival, by the series of omens that supposedly precede and accompany the invasion, and by the apparent relevance of the Quetzalcoatl prophecy, that he panics, dithers, and then surrenders. So as the Cortés legend developed in the 16th century, so did an image of Moctezuma as a cowardly failure whose surrender legitimized Spanish conquest, but also reflected the superstitious, barbaric weakness of the emperor and the civilization that produced him. Historians have been piling on adjectival variations on the theme of Moctezuma as timorous, cowardly, deluded, and foolish, from Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda in 1543 to Barbara Tuchman in 1984 and beyond. Nevertheless, it was clear to Spaniards in 1519 that Moctezuma was the powerful, authoritarian ruler of an expanding empire. So in the decades and centuries after his death, this fact was confirmed. A counter-image thus immediately emerged and survived, one that saw Moctezuma as a prime example of a forceful, aggressive, majestic prince, one willing to lead armies and execute captives with his own hands. Even Vargas Machuca, who cracks that it is, quote, laughable to call Native American rulers kings, recognizes Moctezuma and Atahualpa as exceptions, quote, so powerful and with royal spirit in their dealings, wealth, and governance. So the effect of this counter-image is to turn Moctezuma into a contradiction reified for centuries but never resolved. In portraits, Moctezuma evolved into a generic heathen prince, his contradictory image defying visual representation. And here are some examples of images from the 16th through the 18th century, attempts to represent him. And I love this one particularly on the right here, which is, I believe, the only statue of Moctezuma ever erected in Spain. It survives at the El Escorial, with the cliched representative of generic Indians in the Americas, the feathered headdress and feathered skirt. But I would suggest that what all of these are, as I said, are representing sort of contradiction. So Moctezuma's image, he doesn't make any sense. So what do you do when you don't? It doesn't make sense. You just represent him as some sort of standard, exotic heathen prince or dignitary. Meanwhile, the claim by Franciscan Sahagún in the 1570s that Moctezuma participated unflinchingly in sacrificial rituals himself, but when he heard descriptions of the Spaniards, he, quote, trembled with fear and almost fainted, is echoed over and over by modern writers. For example, the Mexican writer of children's books, Heriberto Frias, wrote in 1925 of the sadly famous Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, doubly cursed as a great general of rapacious conquering armies and as the supreme pontiff of wily, stultifying priesthood. English diplomat and historian Maurice Collis confessed in 1954 that, quote, "One cannot help feeling that Montezuma was a monster and the sacrifice of his captives a ritual murder. Yet this monster, quickly believing that Cortés was the returning god, Quetzalcoatl, was, quote, overwhelmed with awe at the prospect of the god's approach." So here we have the sadly famous emperor portrayed as a lily-livered serial killer. Well, how might we see Cortés and Montezuma differently? First of all, the sources are not as exhausted as one might think. As Hugh Thomas observed 20 years ago now, in addition to scores of manuscript and published accounts from the colonial period, there are over 6,000 pages of Cortés's Residencia, the official investigation into his actions, which stretched from 1526 to 1545 and included the pesquisa secreta, the so-called secret investigation, and thousands more pages of testimony in the residencias of over 100 other conquistadors from Mexico, all of which are preserved in Seville, in the Archivo General de Indias. And when you see that slide, you probably can instantly spot why so few scholars have read all 6,000 of these pages. This was, the little number at the top right-hand corner, 234, that's my handwriting, by the way, in case you're wondering. Like, well, why can't they write that clearly? Look, they can clearly write numbers legibly. Yes, new books continue to come out, but they tend to summarize the same handful of sources, seldom offering new interpretations. Secondly, so firstly, the sources are not as exhausted as you might think. Secondly, the traditional narrative is full of contradictions and holes and red flags. Looking closely at those can create new angles of perception. But we can also view the protagonists in their larger cultural contexts so that their behavior becomes less that of exceptional individuals and becomes more predictable and comprehensible. This is particularly necessary for Montezuma, whose contradictory image as both bloodthirsty monster and superstitious coward simply doesn't make any sense. In seeking Montezuma's revenge, which of course was the first title of the book, either that, Montezuma's Revenge, or the Full Monty, those are my two first choices. So, in all seriousness, in seeking Montezuma's revenge, that is, new angles on the emperor and his behavior, I'm asking three questions. One, how does our larger knowledge of Aztec culture, the empire, and Montezuma's reign allow us to see the emperor differently or more clearly? Well, despite the more sophisticated understanding of the Aztecs that developed in recent decades, the prevailing view since the 1520s has been to see Aztec culture as a dark, blood-stained, thirsty one, tainted by superstition, violence, and even cannibalism. I just was in the British Museum this morning in that wonderful little Mexico room with the lintels, my lintels from Yaxchilan, and some Aztec items. The room was completely, absolutely jam-packed with French school children. And I couldn't help but sort of have images like this in mind as I'm standing there trying to look at the Aztec things. Well, these children are jostling me, and there's some disturbing images of violence did come to my mind, I must confess. Montezuma has easily been tarnished with this same brush. But there are ways to look afresh at the evidence that has been in front of us all along. Now, pre-conquest images of Montezuma, like colonial era paintings, are not reliable as faithful portraits. In other words, this one here, carved into the Chapultepec hillside outside Mexico, Tenochtitlan, it was carved on the emperor's 52nd birthday in 1519, not long before Cortés showed up. and then deliberately vandalized in the late 18th century under orders of the Spanish viceroy. And on the right you can see an art historian at the University of Chicago recreating it. However, these kinds of images, while not faithful portraits, I wouldn't suggest, oh look, that's exactly what Montezuma really looked like and how helpful. I say these kinds of things do tell us something because they show Montezuma as emperor, attesting to his selection in 1502 as Huey Tlatoani, great speaker, chosen from among a pool of eligibles. Such images also attest to his survival on the throne until the Spanish invasion, as at least one previous emperor, Tizoc, was probably murdered. And also to the ways in which his authority and majesty were promoted and sustained. And we can add to that evidence such as the well-known Codex Mendoza, which, as has often been noted, unquestionably demonstrates Montezuma's exercise of authority, both in his royal capital and across an expanding empire. There's also the combined effect of the numerous early colonial chronicles, relaciones, and histories that mention Montezuma's reign. Written by Spanish friars, Spanish Nahua mestizos, and Nahua informants, these sources amount to a sort of hybrid folk history of the emperor, many reflecting indigenous memory, albeit through colonial Christian filters. And in view of the scapegoating of Montezuma, it's significantly surprising how much of this literature casts Montezuma in a positive light. There are literally dozens of such sources, but I'll mention very briefly just three. The Tlaxcalan mestizo Diego Muñoz Camargo, writing an anti-Mexico or anti-Aztec history in the 1590s, portrays Moctezuma, see, he's giving him his reverential full title here, as fearsome, not fearful, not dithering, but relentless in his drive to increase his empire. The emperor described by Juan de Torquemada, also not sympathetic to the Aztecs, was similarly famous for the bravery he showed in leading military campaigns, for an aggressive leadership style, and for, quote, the excessive number of women that he had in his palace. And an example of a whole additional set of relevant early modern sources, John Dryden, in his 1667 play, The Indian Emperor, presented English audiences with a, quote, Montezuma, who in the truth of the history was a great and glorious prince. The second question I'm asking of the Montezuma evidence is there a clue amidst all these sources as to his particular personality, mindset, or worldview? A key to understanding the enigmatic emperor. Right? One that isn't the serial killer idea. He's not Dexter. I believe I found one right in the middle of Tenochtitlan, that is. I didn't hand color that. There are some of the rarer, as I put, I don't know if you can see the captions of them, the rarer copies of this were hand colored. Montezuma's vast royal compound comprised a network of palaces, gardens, and museums. And, here's a detail from the hand-colored version of the map, zoos. In cages, courtyards, and buildings designed to facilitate observation and study, the emperor kept artifacts of all kinds from across the empire. Weaponry, textiles, featherwork, a crew of gardeners tended plants and herbs, organized by categories, and a set of zoos held reptiles, songbirds and birds of prey, separated of course, mammals of all kinds, including human beings with genetic deformities. So here was a culture obsessed not with violence and death, but with order and life, or with the ways in which order might be imposed on the disorder of life. Here was an emperor preoccupied not with cutting out hearts, but with acquiring, organizing, and observing the natural life forms and objects of the world he ruled. In other words, Montezuma was a collector. The key to his worldview was not the blood-drenched altar at the top of the pyramid temple of the war god Huitzilopochtli, but the zoological complex that was spread across his royal compound below that pyramid. And this brings me to my third question that I'm asking of Moctezuma. Why did he not resist the invaders? Why did he seem to vacillate in his response to them over the 6 months leading up to the meeting? Why welcome the Spaniards into Tenochtitlan if not to surrender to them? Because, as a collector, the emperor sought to acquire Cortés and his compatriots. His strategy was designed to control the Spaniards, to weaken but not to destroy them or drive them away, to draw them into the city so that they could be collected. Moctezuma was not afraid of the invaders, he was hunting them. Once acquired, they were housed within the royal compound in the palace of Montezuma's predecessor, adjacent to other collection sites. That palace is right there in the middle with zoos all around it. Over the next 6 months, Moctezuma treated the Spaniards as if they were the newest and most interesting acquisition in his zoo. He displayed them, observed them, learned from them. Now, where he miscalculated was in not realizing that he was far more civilized than they were. Like his lions and tigers, Montezuma's Spaniards couldn't really be tamed. They soon imprisoned their zookeeper, humiliated him, and discarded him. So, viewed from these angles, Moctezuma takes on the characteristics traditionally associated, ironically, with Cortés. It's the emperor, not the conquistador, who emerges as expansionist, magisterial, a born leader, bold, brilliant, a womanizer, a macho man. The following descriptors, taken from Lope de Gomara's biography of Cortés, actually, I would suggest, apply better to Moctezuma. For example, these are all quotes straight from the little summary, the verbal portrait of Cortés that is in the end of this Gomara's hagiography. Very strong, courageous, serene, devout, given to praying, well suited both to war and peace, much given to women, stubbornly argumentative. He dressed more neatly than extravagantly, being a very clean man. He took delight in a large household and family. He carried himself in a lordly way and with much gravity. And finally, my favorite, as a boy, he was told that he would conquer many lands and become a very great lord. So if Moctezuma was more like the stereotypical Cortés, was the real conquistador more like the stereotypical emperor? I think maybe he was. So consider these 3 brief questions. First, if Cortés was a military genius and a natural leader, why did he join only one campaign, the conquest of Cuba, during his 15 years in the Caribbean? And why did he not build on the conquest of Mexico with further successful campaigns? Is it possible that he was in fact a mediocrity elevated by chance above the level of his natural abilities? Perhaps he was a follower more than a leader. His preference as a young man perhaps was just to live an ordinary colonial life as a cattle rancher and a notary, the man who would eventually be portrayed thus. Cortés never initiated a single successful conquest expedition. After 1521, he wasted time, resources, and lives on pointless expeditions to Baja California and Honduras. Back in Spain, he tried to sell the king on similarly absurd ventures, such as a crusade to take Jerusalem from the Turks. Second question, how did Cortés survive the wars and other expeditions? Almost all of the Spaniards who came to the mainland from Cuba in 1519 and in 1520 died in Mexico. Most of them died by the end of the war in 1521. Very few died decades later of old age in Spain. Christian Duverger actually claims Cortés was the only one. I'm not sure if that's right, but it's close. Looking closely at accounts of skirmishes and battles, both in the... Sorry, I jumped ahead. There we go. We still want Fat Cortés for a minute. By the way, that I have named him Fat Cortés, in case you're wondering. That's not an official title. And he doesn't look that fat, so I don't mean to be fattest. Looking closely at accounts of skirmishes and battles, both in the 1519 to 21 war and later expeditions in Mexico and Central America, it becomes clear that Cortés, Like Gilbert and Sullivan's Duke of Platatoro, I'm stealing this from Felipe Fernandez Armesto, Cortés preferred to lead from behind. The indigenous Mexican nobleman Alva Ixtlilxochitl wrote that Cortés proved, quote, what they say about all cruel men being cowards. Now, Ixtlilxochitl was as biased as any colonial era source, but he rightfully noted how Cortés kept his head down. He allowed others to take the blows. The instinct that saved him was one of self-preservation, not boldness. Perhaps this portrait, a scene from a 17th century screen fold or biombo of the fall of Tenochtitlan, unintentionally captures the spirit of a leader who posed rather than fought, who took the limelight but not the slings and arrows. And I don't even have to point out to you which one is Cortés. Based on what I just said, you can just see him standing there, the poser. 3, if we undermine Cortés' military machismo, how do we explain his palace full of women in Coyoacán? The answer lies in Mexico's political reality in the 1520s, when New Spain existed in name only. Now, the new settlers were few in number, concentrated near the ruins of Mexico Tenochtitlan, and bitterly divided. The Aztec Empire was still largely intact, and the only way for the few Spaniards to survive was to keep it that way. The empire was still run by a coalition of conquistadors and Nahua nobles, men like the grandson of Moctezuma, renamed Capitan Don Gonzalo Matatzin Moctezuma. He reconquered 20 towns in the Oaxaca region in the early 1520s. Supposedly, this is part of the Spaniards exercising control over the new empire, but in Matatzin Moctezuma's campaigns, there were mostly no Spaniards present at all. In other words, the initial transition was not yet the shift to colonial rule, but merely a change in rulership at the center. The message was, the empire lives on, keep paying tribute, the old Way Tlatoani is dead, long live the new one. So for the transition to work, and I'm focusing here just for this point, specifically in the 1520s, for this transition to work, Cortés was obliged to play the role of Montezuma's successor, to assume his throne, to inherit his royal complex, complete with a court and household that reflected his majesty. So as a result, not only did his house in Coyoacán become staffed with concubines and other women, the famous Malinche, for example, but some of those selected had also been part of Montezuma's household. One was the emperor's senior daughter, Tecuichpo Ixcaxochitzin, christened Doña Isabel Moctezuma. Doña Isabel was briefly married to both of her father's successors, Cuitlahuac and Cuauhtemoc, then transferred to Cortés in 1521 as if he were the next in line to the throne. She lived on and off in his Coyoacán house, despite being formally married to a series of Spaniards, and bore Cortés a child, allegedly 5 months after she married her second conquistador husband. Can you imagine what this woman's life was like? And while she's being transferred between these Aztec emperors and then onto Cortés, she's still a teenager. We could read this as, on Cortés's part, simple promiscuity, as his enemies did in giving testimony in the Pesquisa Secreta. But one of these enemies unwittingly hit the nail on the head, I think, when he testified that Cortés lived like a heathen, not a Christian. For I don't think Cortés can be given credit or blame for his Coyoacán household. I think it was Nahua custom, not his alleged proclivities, that determined what happened in the 1520s. As successor to the rulership of Mexico, Cortés had no choice but to become a Montezuma impersonator. To conclude, and thank you for bearing with me for so long. What really happened on the day of the meeting? Did Montezuma surrender? No. Did the Spaniards peacefully enter Tenochtitlan? Yes. Was their entry marked by an encounter and exchange of speeches between Cortés and Moctezuma? Yes. So what did the emperor say? He welcomed Cortés into the city, delivering a speech that was concomitant with forms of Nahuatl address appropriate to his imperial status and the formality of the event. I think the key to understanding Montezuma's speech is the corpus of texts in which classical Nahua was preserved in the early colonial period. Records of how the language was spoken in Montezuma's day and under what circumstances. The circumstance of the meeting required the emperor to welcome Cortés with an elaborate, reverential, gracious, self-deprecating speech of welcome. The Jesuit scholar of Nahua, Horacio Carocci, described in 1645 how reverential forms of words created a virtual dialect of courtly Nahua. Quote, "The Mexican language has one thing which elevates it greatly and in which it outdoes even the languages of Europe." So the purpose of Montezuma's speech was to ritually display the emperor's majesty, to reassure the visitors that they were guests, not new acquisitions to his zoo. Now, did Cortés therefore accurately remember and record this speech? Well, clearly not. But he did grasp its essence, which we can reduce to a bumper sticker, as we say in America, welcome. But he then reconstructed it using his own cultural reference points to serve his own political ends. This was not a stroke of genius, but the predictable response of any conquistador. The reference points were the Bible, the Spanish law code, the Siete Partidas, and the triumphal entry of the medieval and early modern periods, rooted in the Adventus ceremony with which Roman emperors entered cities. So in Cortés's mind, if not in the minds of the Spaniards who accepted and spread the surrender myth, the memory of the 1492 meeting of Boabdil and Ferdinand and Isabella outside Granada must have resonated. A meeting that, of course, really was a surrender. 7 years later, that's 7 years after the 1519 meeting. 7 years later, when Cortés re-entered Mexico Tenochtitlan, on his return from Honduras, his allies, relieved that he was not dead, as had been reported, staged an elaborate welcome that drew on the combined cultural context of all of these traditions and events, but which must have reified the notion that Cortés's first entry into the city had also been triumphal. Thus, for Spaniards, Montezuma's meek surrender and Cortés's triumphant entry was providential, logical, legitimizing, and reassuring. To them, the story just made sense, regardless of whether it happened that way or not. And for the Mexica and other Nahuas, and for those who have chosen to study them in the last 100 years, the other side of the same coin had its own providential logic, with the scapegoating of the emperor modulated by the unstoppable Quetzalcoatl Cortés myth. Yet if my alternative reading of the meeting and its two central protagonists comes even a tiny bit closer to reality, one wonders if Spaniards and Nahuas alike might not have seen the virtues of a revisionist view. A Cortés brought down to size, seen much like other Spaniards, a Montezuma whose majesty remains more or less uncompromised. One wonders too what conquest-era Nahuas would have made of Castilleja de la Cuesta, had they been able to visit it, as I did last year. Cortés died in this Spanish village in 1547, but I looked in vain for any commemorative plaque or monument, finding only in a local bar this evidence of the impact of the conquistador and his encounter with the Mexica emperor. I wished I'd had a few Mexica warriors with me to tell me their version of the meeting of November the 8th, 1519, while together we dropped €1 coins into the machine, hoping they would lead us to Montezuma's missing treasure. Thank you very much.
Very much, Matthew. We're running a little bit late, but I think there's still time for a couple of questions, if people have them. I'm sure you're all sort of reflecting on these alternative interpretations of things. I might want time to reflect on that before asking questions, but if there are any. If I can just ask about the Nahua images, you show how you can interpret those concerned with Moctezuma, but are there any that really look at Cortés that you could say have not been strongly influenced by Spanish interpretation? Like the codexes I'm thinking of.
Yes, and I did go on a while there, so I'm going to try to be really brief in the answer. I think there are many different ways to answer that question. I think one of the most obvious ones and most interesting ones is Malinche. So I mentioned her several times, but in order to kind of cram in the core ideas here, I didn't talk about her very much. In Spanish visual representations and in textual accounts, Malinche is really, really downplayed. She typically will get mentioned once or twice in a text as if you sort of know that she's around, but you don't know who she is. In Nahua or indigenous representation, she is often actually in the middle. So that is clearly an accurate reflection of the fact that whatever communication there may have been between Cortés and Moctezuma, and that's a whole other subject there, which I think is really interesting. I think communication was minimal and extremely flawed and complex, but whatever there was done through Malinche as the interpreter, or Malinsin as the interpreter. So from indigenous people, she's right there in the middle, and then they're on either side. And of course, they called Cortés Malinche.
There's a question at the back. Either you can shout or
I can speak now. Okay.
I'll just repeat it too.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. I feel quite seduced by your idea, and I feel very seduced by this idea, and I'm like, oh, that's a cool interpretation. I like that better. I'm Mexican, so I feel like, oh yeah, I like that. But I have a question that has, well, I'm not a historian, so bear with me. When you mentioned that one of the reasons that maybe this has not been taken on has been the sources, and you mentioned these with the one you wrote the numbers, and you said there were lots of. So I was wondering if there's another reason you're not telling us about why that hasn't been read, really. Has it been like just that historians gave up too quickly, or you are really sort of trying to see something there, or what thing that or have you read them? A bit of them. That's a really good question. That's the key question, and I'm always disappointed when somebody doesn't stand up and say, "Hey, Clever Clogs, have you read the 6,000 pages?" I haven't read all 6,000 pages. No, I've read a significant chunk of the 6,000 pages, both in the archive itself and also in the form of various collections that were put together beginning in the middle of the 19th century. So for the last 150 years, scholars almost overwhelmingly in Spain, not in Mexico, have said, okay, I'm going to publish these 6,000 pages. I'm going to get in, I'm going to start transcribing. No, none of them are in English, they're just transcriptions in Spanish, right? So off they go on their 19th century typewriters or whatever, and they give up at some point, and they end up doing summaries or excerpts, and there are mistakes and so on. And so part of the problem is, first of all, you've got to be able to access the original documentation, and the archive in Seville wants you to read them on microfilm, which, as you probably know, makes you feel seasick. And then you've got to be able to read. It's not just the 16th century Spanish, but much harder than that is the paleography. It's really almost a separate alphabet, right? So at some point you go, okay, this is too much, and I don't want to spend a whole year in Seville reading this because I want to spend more time in the tapas bars, because that's really why we go to Seville. So I'll look at some of these transcriptions from the 19th and 20th century, and then you find they have so many problems in them. Okay, so that's part of the answer. But the other thing is, what are these documents exactly? They are in classic colonial Spanish style
legal documents, inquiries in which a set of questions are prepared in advance, and then those questions are put to the witnesses. So it's not, please tell, could the witness please tell us, what you were doing on the night of the 17th, or something like that. It's not that open, so you don't get free discursive descriptions by witnesses. Instead, you are asked a very leading specific question, and if you don't like the way the question is phrased, because it's trying to lead you into saying, if it's a question like something like, is it not true that Cortés lost a large quantity of gold in the escape from Mexico City, gold which he did not then turn over to the king of Spain? And if you're an ally of Cortés, you go, I don't know anything about that. So that's half a page of one of these documents right there. So they are difficult to read and don't make sense unless you can compile hundreds and hundreds of pages of testimony. So, for example, I'm trying to be quick here. One of the things that really interests me is a little thing I threw out here. Did Cortés murder his wife? As a Mexican, I'd be interested in what you think of that, because my understanding is that, and at some point somebody did a survey, it's about 20 years ago, asked Mexicans, do you think Cortés murdered his wife? And 80-something% said yes. Why do you think Cortés murdered? That's just what I was told. I grew up with this, what Mexicans believe he murdered his wife. I thought, okay. So I go and look in the literature. It's kind of there as this thing. Yeah, modern scholars, Duverger, Hugh Thomas, people who've written more recent biographies, the evidence is not really very strong. I thought, okay, I'm going to go and read the part of the Pesquisa Secreta about the supposed murder of his wife. Well, if you're thinking there's going to be some great little account in there or some secret bit of evidence or something like that this is what people have missed, there really isn't. What you have to do is read through all of the testimony, and then where's the rest of it? You can't find it. It's buried in a different part of it. I mean, it really is 6,000 pages, right? I don't think he killed his wife. I think if you kind of put together all of these little bits and pieces, it's pretty clear that he didn't, and in fact, I'm doing a whole chapter in this book just on his relationship with women, because I think that's part of how his legend has been created of him as this kind of womanizer. Killed his wife because he had a whole palace full of other women, and he was having children with all of them and so on, and I don't think it's true. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm going to let somebody else.
Any other questions? I'll just put the back name of Caroline.
Caroline, you're up.
Me?
Yeah.
I was going to ask you the same question about the residencia, Matthew. In those, I'm sure you haven't gone through 6,000 pages of it, I don't know how long it takes to read these. But, thank you. But I wonder, is there any reference in the residencia to that meeting of November 1590?
Oh, that's a
Was anybody asked the question?
That's a great question. Okay, so that's how I started, and I spent a whole week in Seville just with the Residencia documents, just looking for the meeting, thinking, oh, it has to be some good stuff in here. No, they don't care about the meeting. It's not mentioned. They don't really care about Montezuma. It's really hard to find references in the Residencia to Montezuma. Overwhelmingly, you could probably guess. We did a poll. What do you think? This is, remember, a royal investigation, almost 20 years long, into what Cortés did, and it overwhelmingly focuses just on the end of the war itself, and then that brief period in the 1520s when he ruled Mexico. He did not rule Mexico for very long. They kicked him out really quickly. What do you think that all of these pages mostly are concerned with?
Money.
Exactly, right. Where's the gold? Where's the gold? And I don't think the gold existed. This is Cortés' own fault. And I'm not quite sure how to kind of pitch this, but just sort of off the record, what an idiot, right? What he did was he wanted to sell the whole thing to the king by saying, there's masses and masses of gold, right? Let's put it out that there's all this gold here. It's actually, Norman Spinrad wrote a novel. He's an Englishman. I have no idea who he is beyond that, called Mexica. And I've been reading everything I can find on this subject, including novels. It's actually not bad. And he has some theories in this novel, which I wish I could find in real sort of scholarly works. And one of them is that Cortés, instead of sending back the king's fifth, which is what he was obliged to send back, because he wanted the king to believe that there was more gold than there really was, he sent all of it. And the other Spaniards were like, you can't send the king absolutely everything. It's like, don't tell us no. I don't think it existed, but then he created this problem. So for the next 20 years, royal officials are like, where the heck is the gold? And then he has to torture Cuauhtemoc, set fire to his feet to get the gold. And of course, Penn was like, you know full well that there isn't any gold, but it's all kind of an unpleasant ritual that they're going through to sort of cover up the lie. It's the old thing that once you start the lie, then you just get dug in deeper and deeper, and I think that's what happened.
Yeah, so 2 questions. I love the lecture. I was with you all the way till the end, and you made the comparison with 1492, and you said, of course, that was a real surrender. How do you know? This one wasn't.
Okay.
And then the other question is, I was really not expecting a lecture like this from you, which kind of resuscitates great men in history. And Cortés and Moctezuma and the encounter, it was all about these great guys. So maybe you can justify that or say kind of be a
I like both of those questions very much. Okay, so the first one, I don't know. I'm intrigued by 1492 and whether that was a reference point. And one of the things that I have been doing is looking for Spaniards in talking about the meeting or any of this that I've been talking about today as an echo of 1492. Granada, Tenochtitlan, Boabdil, Montezuma and so on, and it doesn't seem to be a specific reference point, and I'm not quite sure how to play that as an argument. I have a hard time not believing that it wasn't in the back of their minds in some way. As far as I've got in that right now is I'm realizing that the idea of a triumphal entry is so sort of meaningful and commonplace to Spaniards. It's very much a part of European tradition. It becomes a common ritual in Mexico City very, very quickly. In fact, what they don't recreate is that in the meeting of November the 8th, they recreate the fall of Tenochtitlan in August the 13th, 1521. But when they recreate that, they don't recreate the collapse or the destruction of the city or the surrender of Cuauhtemoc. They process out of the city to the shrine to the saint of whose day it is, and then they all process back into the city, and the bishop processes and goes to his palace, and the viceroy goes to his palace. And so I think that so the way I'm thinking of playing this is they don't need to specifically mention 1492 and Boabdil because it's so much a kind of a part of the way in which they look at cities, conquest, arriving, and so on. But was Boabdil really a surrender? I like that, and I'm going to think a little bit more about whether there's a kind of a revisionist angle. Okay, now your other question very quickly is, what the heck are you doing reviving great men? You're absolutely right, it's really risky. I mean, that's part of what I like about this project is it's constantly kind of a challenge, and I constantly have moments as I'm working my way through it. I'm actually sort of in somewhere about a third of the way through actually writing the book, having moments thinking, maybe I've really messed up here. I'm just tripping myself up in all kinds of directions. And one of them is trying to do a revisionist history that ends up kind of going full circle and making Montezuma and Cortés being, the key important protagonists after all. And I have thought about that. You're absolutely right. I'm not quite sure how I can argue my way out of it, either in front of you or in the book. But you'll just have to see whether I can or not.
We've probably just got time for one more question, maybe another one. 2 more questions.
Yeah, I similarly enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Matthew. I'm a Peruvianist, primarily.
I know where you're going, yes.
And, obviously, there are very many striking similarities. Mm-hmm. And what was occurring to me as you were kind of running through all of these various aspects was the degree to which either what you've been looking at creates a template that is then pursued elsewhere, or if what you've been looking at follows a template that's previously been created, and if that template can be destabilized in the case that you're looking at, what are the consequences for the other cases of conquest, arrival, encounter, and justification that follow it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And of course, I'm going to try and be really quick here because I think people are getting thirsty and they can hear clinking out there. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Peruvian example is it's sort of it's the elephant in the room, right? You can kind of try to ignore it, but sooner or later it's going to start trumpeting. And I think that I'm going to sort of have footnotes drawing people in the direction. But the short answer to that is what I think Pizarro is trying to do is not to imitate what really happened, but to imitate what Cortés said happened. And I think that's what's kind of interesting. And whether Pizarro knew that it didn't really happen like that, I don't know. But hey, look, the whole kind of surrender myth, it doesn't make any sense because there was a horrific war. Right? That siege of Tenochtitlan is one of the most bloody and violent sieges in all of human history. In terms of the mortality rate in that war, in that concentrated period of time, it's one of history's nastiest wars. And that comes after the surrender. It doesn't make any sense. Pizarro must have known that full well. Everybody knew what Cortés claimed had happened because those letters were so widely read and circulated in print in multiple editions. And everybody knew what had really happened. So I think that's why the Spaniards in Cajamarca behave the way they do. It's like, let's reproduce what Cortés said happened in Tenochtitlan, even though we know didn't go that way. And so what's the outcome of that going to be? Panic and slaughter immediately, right? You don't want to have to go through that whole narrative of being a guest and then seizing him and then 6 months, and it's like Moctezuma and Cortés are holed up in this palace. It's sort of like Caesar and Cleopatra, except one of them doesn't end up pregnant at the end of the 6 months. But it's the same kind of like weird two famous people stuck together and you don't know what's really going on. You don't want to go through all of that. Pizarro wants to speed the whole process up. Let's not catch it. Let's kill him as quickly as we can. Let's slaughter as many people. We don't want the Noche Triste. We're going to speed up the whole conquest of Peru and not go through what the Spaniards went through. So I think that I'm hoping that people will read this and go, well, I don't know if Restall really made his case. It's a little bit outlandish, but maybe it'll make us think a little bit differently about what happens elsewhere in the Americas. Thank you so much for your patience and attention.
Well, I've just got 3 points of thanks. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating lecture and a visually stunning lecture. It's absolutely wonderful. Secondly, yesterday a member of the Society chided us historians for the fact that we didn't have any history panels in SLAS. So I want to thank you for making a contribution from the community of historians to this conference. And thirdly, as someone who also works on early colonial Spanish America, thank you for demonstrating to us what fun actually early colonial history can be. So thank you very much.